Earlier this month, hackers effectively took a pipeline in the U.S. hostage, returning control only after a hefty ransom was paid. Joining us now on the potential for such an attack on critical infrastructure here in Canada, and as is our custom, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital with Robert Gordon. He's Executive Director of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. In Kingston, Ontario, Christian Leuprecht, Professor in Leadership at the Royal Military College, Director of Queen's University's Institute of Intergovernmental Relations, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Intelligence as Democratic Statecraft. And in Oshawa, Ontario, Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and she is author of Stand on Guard, Reassessing Threats to Canada's National Security. And it's great to have you three with us here on TVO tonight. I just want to read a couple of brief paragraphs here to get some background on the record to bring our listeners and viewers up to speed on this. Earlier this month, the Colonial Pipeline, a nearly 8,900 kilometer pipeline between Texas and New Jersey, which transports nearly half of the U.S. East Coast's fuel supplies, well, it was hacked. To avoid losing control of the pipeline, the company said it shut down operations. Colonial paid $4.4 million to the ransomware gang DarkSide to get the pipeline back up and running. And the BBC, in its reporting, described this as one of the most significant attacks on critical national infrastructure in history. Stephanie, that's the way the BBC describes it. How would you describe it?
A very serious incident that I think has served as a wake-up call to pretty much any critical infrastructure operator, whether they be the government, the private sector, and, hopefully most industries, which now actually contain a lot of our private data. So, this really shows that these kinds of attacks can happen to anyone, pretty much anywhere, including here in Canada today. And I think it's, we've seen so many different kinds of serious cyber incidents in the last 6 months. This is really just another indication, but it's also further evidence that there is, something of a second pandemic happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is really a cybersecurity crisis.
I've never heard that metaphor used before, a second pandemic in cybersecurity. Christian, I'm very interested to know what your initial reaction was when you heard about this story.
Not particularly surprised. Ransomware is an $18 billion a year industry, and you hit critical infrastructure, they're even more likely to pay up because they know they need to get the oil flowing again. It reminds us of the vulnerability of our system overall. I think this is the sort of thing that people in North America thought happens elsewhere in the world. It doesn't happen here, and it also reminds us to what extent we're also vulnerable, not just to state-based threats, as we saw with SolarWinds or with the Microsoft Exchange exploit, but to non-state actors that are then subsequently hosted by state actors and to some extent are working in collusion to undermine our security, our prosperity, and our democracy on a daily basis. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of what happens on a permanent basis, the threat that we're under.
Robert, did the attack catch you off guard at all?
No, not particularly, not that specific attack. I mean, we've been expecting a major attack for a while. We've seen all the indicators pointing the direction of something big is going to happen. What we didn't know were some of the specifics of it. We didn't know sort of which industry was going to be attacked, which critical infrastructure entity was going to be done. We didn't know the exact timing of it, and we didn't know the consequences of it. What are the secondary issues or things that happen when an attack occurs? And that's what exactly played out in SolarWinds. An attack in one part of the company had an impact on the other part of the company, the operational part of the company, and that's what actually had an impact on the general public.
Stephanie, I'm interested in your reaction to the group that is claiming responsibility for this. It's called DarkSide. They're thought to reside in Russia. They deny having any political motives or links to the Russian government. They say our goal is to make money and not create problems for society. Should we take that at face value?
I think the main issue here is that, there have been allegations, say, by the FBI that they were looking for links between this group as well as the Russian government. And, we do know certain things about this group that, for example, they actually have articles of principles. They are a ransomware as service provider. So in other words, they have a software platform, and then they basically interview potential criminal gangs that want to use it. And if they pass, they become affiliates. They can then use it and pass it on. And as a part of those terms and conditions, for lack of a better term, they are not allowed to attack things within the Commonwealth of Independent States, or basically Russia, as well as, they're not supposed to attack certain things that I think would drive a lot of attention to them. So are there links between them and the Russian government? It's hard to say. There's been a lot of speculation. In my view, I think the bigger issue is that there are these gangs that are operating in Russia and Russian territory and other countries as well with impunity. Right? The Russian government is allowing this to happen, probably because, even if it isn't directing the behavior, it benefits from it. It benefits from a lot of the chaos that results from having a major pipeline in the United States shut down for a week. So, I think that's the general issue. Even if we can't point fingers at the Russian state, we should be raising very serious questions as to why Russia is allowing these gangs in the first place and why they aren't actually doing anything about it.
Christian, who should we raise those questions with?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically cyber piracy, and the Russians are effectively hosting and endorsing cyber piracy, if you want to find an analogy. And so the problem here is a challenge of deterrence, that there need to be consequences for countries that tolerate non-state actors that engage in this sort of behavior. And those consequences might be in the cyber realm, but they also can be in the kinetic realm in terms of sanctions and otherwise. But it's very dangerous and reckless behavior by entities that pose a serious risk to our way of life and the way we run our democracies and our economy. And so that's why it's ultimately significant that we deter this type of behavior from any type of actor, even if they can claim some distance from the state in and of itself.
Well, Robert, let's figure out what that exactly means. If we are looking to impose some consequences on Russia, even though this group, DarkSide, claims it's not operating on behalf of the Russian government, what are our options? What can we do?
Well, I think there's a few things. One, on the defensive side of it, we can get better at protecting ourselves. We can start to do some of that planning, some of that preparation, and a lot of the critical infrastructure is actually doing that. We can get better on collaborating. So the federal government has got a number of initiatives led by the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity in trying to assist the private sector in getting harder at the other side. And then on the third end of it, I think we've got to be more proactive at going after the cyber criminals. So how can we do the things that will make it less attractive for them to do these attacks? At the bottom line, criminals are interested in getting access to money. They want to commit a fraud. So how do we make that harder for them to do that? Are there some ways we can go after, for example, if they're buying Bitcoins, is there some way we can actually be better at tracking that money and make it less financially attractive for them?
Well, Stephanie, let me just ask the direct question. Should we be doing cyber attacks against Russia or helping those who want to perpetuate those kinds of attacks on Russia?
Well, it is interesting in that the group DarkSide has posted on the so-called dark web that it has in fact lost control of its digital wallet. So I believe, the ransom that was paid that you had up there was around $4.4 million in the United States, that money has now disappeared, that they've actually lost control of some of their platforms. And we don't really know if this is true. We don't know if this was, the United States going back after these criminals. And we don't know if they're just trying to pretend that this was the case in order that they can, people who did this can lay low for a bit, because they now realize just how much attention is on them. With regards to cyber attacks, look, I think Canada does have an interest in trying to promote good cyber norms and trying to stop this behavior. So, if on the one hand we're telling Russia, look, knock this off, and then on the other hand we're going after these people, we have to be careful in how we balance that equation going forward. And, I think one of the chief issues here, particularly in the United States, there's been a lot of emphasis in recent years on cyber offense, or what we call here in Canada, active cyber, whereas in Canada, we've always kind of felt the best defense is a good defense. And I think, in having put together more of an emphasis on defense and trying to ensure that our critical infrastructure sectors have a point of contact and these kinds of things has benefited us more in the long run. So should we be going after these guys? Absolutely. The United States is much better at doing things like attribution and actually bringing criminal charges against individuals, even if there's not much of a chance that these individuals will eventually end up in the United States. I think it's a really important step for them to take, and I think we should be doing that as well. With regards to actual cyber offensive actions, I think it's just not, and deterrence isn't just, you punch me and I punch you back harder in cyberspace. It has to be more of a delicate balance of activities that I think we need to be undertaking.
Well, let me follow up with Robert on that, because more than a little over a decade ago, you were the architect of Canada's first cybersecurity strategy. Can you describe how the cyber threat has changed from a decade ago to today?
Yeah, when we created the strategy, as you say, I hate to say it's over a decade ago. One of the things was you have to build a strategy within the context of what's the general understanding of the threat environment, how do you move that forward? So at the time, we were really concerned about attacks coming into the federal government, so that was our focus. But since then, the threat environment has changed dramatically. We're talking about the sophistication, the technical ability, and the speed at which cyber attackers are changing and ramping up their game has really increased over the last few years. How they go after companies and the government has changed tremendously. We've also seen a change in who the attackers are going after. They're no longer just going after companies that may have some trade secrets or things that they want to hide to protect from their own corporate interest perspective. They're now going at literally any company, because they're going after, particularly on the criminal side, they're going after and want to commit fraud. They want to steal your money. They want to deny you access to your information. And that means every single company is now susceptible to a cyber attack. That's a huge change in the threat environment. And it then changes how we have to be responding when we start to look at that. And the second thing is cybercrime has now become a business. They run it like a business. Stephanie was talking about ransomware as a service. They'll now provide you with the tools to actually undertake a cyber attack if you're not particularly sophisticated from a technological sense, and it'll come with a service guarantee and a help desk to call in. So the cyber threat environment has changed a lot since I wrote architected the first strategy, as you say, over a decade ago.
Christian, my hunch is that when this story broke, the Colonial Pipeline story, a lot of Canadians, their first thought was, I wonder if they could do that here. And if they could, how easy or difficult it would be to do. So let me ask you the question, how vulnerable are we and our infrastructure to this kind of attack?
Well, so to follow up from Bob's point, that look, there's been a proliferation of threat actors, state and non-state alike. The target surface has widened substantially from state to private sector to individuals, and you've had a significant decrease in the cost of entry for bad actors. And so as a result, we live in a relatively vulnerable and hostile environment, and Canada, of course, no exception to that. In addition to that, we're highly interlinked and networked with the United States. So if you're trying to cause some sort of disruption in the United States, often Canadian critical infrastructure will be just as good to go after as US infrastructure because of the consequences, the second order effects that follow from it. And so while in terms of the 11 critical infrastructure sectors in Canada, the strategy that Bob devised has been quite proactive, it's difficult to protect against simple mistakes like Colonial Pipeline, not keeping proper digital hygiene, patching in a timely fashion, and making sure that their connections with third party supply chain companies are of the level of security that they need to be. And so often these are basic mistakes that can readily be remedied.
Stephanie, I don't want to be irresponsible here, but I'm walking a bit of a tightrope here, because on the one hand, I want our viewers and listeners to understand what's at stake here and what potential catastrophes could take place. On the other hand, I don't want to throw any ideas out there to give anybody some ideas. But my hunch is anybody who would do this, they know all this already. So can you gingerly sketch out a potential attack that someone might make on some critical piece of infrastructure in Canada and a potential scenario around that?
Well, I think, earlier I said that, we're dealing with a second pandemic, and that is really a lot of the cyber threats and the increase of cyber threats. Already, Bob and Christian have said, the threat surface has just increased so much. And since so many of us are working from home, including me right now in my parents' basement, they are, the fact is, it's just easier for these groups to penetrate all different kinds of systems, because people are working from their home Wi-Fi networks, which are not secured in the same way. And they're also, are not behind perhaps the kind of safeguards that they would normally have. So let's walk through that. If you are working in a company, doing some kind of research or lab work right now, there's all different kinds of ways and actors that are trying to penetrate your systems to not only encrypt your devices in order to hold it hostage, but also to get that information and exploit it, right? This is a new phenomenon as well. So if you're working on sensitive information on a sensitive system, just because you're working from home, your data is, they get access to your network, they're able to encrypt your system, and then they may actually be able to also exfiltrate certain amounts of data and hold it hostage and say, we're going to put all this sensitive data on the internet, right? So it's not just ransomware anymore. We're also dealing with exploitationware as well. And this is a huge problem. So, and that's just, people working from home. I mean, if you think about it, we hear on an almost daily basis now of different healthcare providers being attacked, during COVID, making it very hard for these systems that are already under stress. We have seen in the past a number of hospitals being targeted. And the urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the early months when people were seeking on information, it's very easy to send an email that panics you. And you click on it and you click on the attachment. And that's all it takes for these individuals to get access to your system. And we're talking here about all different kinds of systems. So, if you see here for like, hey, there's been an outbreak in the company and you need to click on this email or click on this link or click on this attachment to find out more information, that instills a sense of panic in you. And you click on it perhaps without thinking, is this actually from my company? Is this actually from someone I know, someone I trust? You're just worried about your own health. And then once they have access to your system, they're either, stealing the data or encrypting it or doing something kind of malicious with it that, you don't necessarily appreciate. And we've seen this in pretty much every sector, from education through to healthcare, now the energy sector as well. And as more and more employees are working from home, this is why we have seen this level of threat increase.
Well, that's a great point, because I guess we should not draw the inference from this colonial situation that these forces are going to be targeting the CN Tower or some pipeline out west. I mean, the reality is they could attack anything. And I guess the second thing I should say is we're grateful to your parents that they're letting you use their basement so that we can have you on our program tonight. So thanks, Mom and Dad. The third thing is, okay, Christian, pick up the story. Stephanie referred to they. Who's the they? Who's targeting us?
So the array of actors is so broad because the costs of entry now are so relatively low. But it's also important to understand that 98% of these attacks are relatively low level and low skill types of attacks. And the challenge for entities such as Colonial Pipeline that are up against DarkSide or state-based actors that went after SolarWinds or the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability is that they're extremely sophisticated. And so we can blame the private sector for perhaps not doing enough and not coordinating better and not engaging in digital hygiene. But really, in many ways, this is a little bit like bringing a knife to a gunfight. And so this is why the relationship between the private sector and government here is critically important, because government can play a key role in providing assistance with detection of possible vulnerabilities and attacks. It can provide assistance in defending against these types of attacks. And on the intelligence side, it provides an offensive capability, not necessarily in terms of attack, but simply the ability to lurk in the systems of adversaries to understand what their capabilities are, what their intent might be, and what they might be able to go after. Because in this space, really advanced intelligence is your best defense, understanding what your adversary is up to and being able to be prepared for them, because you ultimately, in terms of deterrence, you want to engage in deterrence by denial so that the threat actor can succeed, as opposed to then having to engage in deterrence by punishment, which means that there's going to be consequences.
Robert, I should get you to comment on that metaphor. Do you think we in Canada are kind of so far behind the times on this that we're bringing a knife to a gunfight?
I don't think it's quite that bad. I think it's certainly a challenge for all of us, but I think there's a lot of steps that are being taken both by government and by industry is starting to harden the things up. And you were talking about the flow between Canada and the United States. I mean, we've had two completely interconnected economies, and that also applies in the cyberspace. Our cyber regimes are interconnected. You know, when you look at the energy flow, most energy in North America flows north and south. It doesn't flow east and west. So there's a lot of work going on within the electricity sector, as an example, in sort of ensuring that the cyber hygiene on both sides of the border is sufficient that neither one of us become vulnerable. So that's part of it. Do we have some steps to go? Absolutely, yes. There's more that we can be doing, but we're moving in the direction. So I like to look on the optimistic side. Yes, we can get things better. And I think one of the things we've got to be thinking about is some of the unintended consequences of cyber attacks occurring. In the past, we've just looked at what happens within one part of the company when a cyber attack occurs. And I think when you look back on the Colonial Pipelines attack, it's a good example where an attack, what appears to have been inside the IT side of it, or what runs the business, had the risk of actually going over, and they had to shut down the operational side of the building. We don't know whether the attackers actually wanted to do that, whether they wanted to shut down the pipeline. What the attackers wanted to do was to get a ransom out of it. And so how do they put the pressure on? Did they realize the company was actually going to shut down the pipeline as a result of that? And I think we have to start building that into our planning. And that comes back to the government and trying to help us do that. Christian talked about the collaboration we're seeing between the federal government, huge steps that they've taken over the past couple of years and starting to do that. So we're starting that dialogue. We just have to continue. We've got to move it along.
Well, Stephanie, tell me this. I presume we hear more about this when things go wrong. You don't hear about things, obviously, when an attack is attempted and we have successfully fended it off. So is it fair to say right now that that our forces are, at the moment, prevailing? Because thankfully, we don't hear a lot about this in Canada.
I think it's actually hard to say, in the sense that the fact that, we actually have pretty good oversight of the number of attacks that happen against government systems, because, that is kind of managed through a process through the Communication Security Establishment, and it's kind of, open-facing institution, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity that Bob mentioned earlier, as well as Shared Services Canada, which is responsible for kind of coordinating a lot of the cyber infrastructure that we have protecting the Canadian government. And we know that they fend off like billions of attacks a day, many of which are automated, as Christian said, some of the lower level ones. And when they're more successful, we know that the government can come in, monitor that, and we're okay. The problem is the private sector. We still don't have good information from them. I mean, some of the institutions, particularly the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, which Bob leads, is really important in trying to, share information and practices and trying to be a conduit of information between the private sector and government. That said, the private sector still doesn't have to report if it's been hit in this way. And, if it has cyber insurance companies don't necessarily want to go public. They may just want to keep things quiet, try to negotiate some kind of settlement and get the information back. And so long as, privacy hasn't really been affected by this ransomware attack, they don't have to go public with it. So I would say that there's still not a lot that we know. And I know that this is something that, the Communication Security Establishment and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity would like to know more about, so we have a better understanding of just how Canada is impacted. The final thing I'll just say here, though, is I do share, Bob's optimism. It's a bleak optimism, maybe, but, Canada is actually fairly well placed relative to some of its Five Eyes partners. And the Five Eyes, of course, is our major intelligence sharing partners, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. But, if you look at the way our cyber defense infrastructure, for lack of a better word, is arranged, it's actually a little bit better than most of our counterparts. In the United States, it's distributed across so many different agencies that have some kind of responsibility. And in the UK, it started off being fairly centralized, but has decentralized over time. in Canada, we really have, we kind of taken the opposite step. Back in, 2016, 2017, we saw the creation of the Cyber Center and the removing of certain cyber responsibilities from different government agencies and put into the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. So we've centralized it. We've created a point of contact, which makes addressing these issues a lot easier, because then you're not trying to coordinate a large number of actors across, the government spectrum when trying to respond to these kinds of incidents. We've kind of centralized that, which makes us a bit more nimble. And I think it makes it a bit more easy for different companies who have been affected and are trying to get advice. They know where to go.
Robert, I should get you to follow up on one of the things that Stephanie just said, that being whether or not the private sector, in your view, has a duty to report to some kind of public sector organization, government, whatever, on whether they've been attacked. What's your view?
I think there's two answers to that question. One is I'd like to get out in front of it. The problem with reporting after the attack is useful from one perspective. But what I'd like to see the private sector doing is actually doing more exchanging of information so that companies can prevent attacks from occurring. So the reporting after the attack is, yes, that's nice, but I've already been attacked and I've suffered. So what can we be doing in a collaborative sense in front to making it easier for me to stop that attack from occurring? And I think there's some things the government could probably be doing to enable that collaboration, that sharing of threat information at the front end. They could put some legislation into effect that will protect companies when they voluntarily share information about, indicators of compromise that they're seeing, about threat actors and how they're performing, ideas on how to protect themselves. That's the kind of thing you want to be doing up front. You want to stop the risk of occurring. You want to stop having to actually report that I've been attacked. And then once the attack occurs, then yes, there should be some way of going forward and reporting that back in. And I think it's got to be reporting more than just is personal information been compromised, because in some instances, cyber attacks will be occurring where the personal information isn't or hasn't been compromised. So you may not have to actually report it into the privacy commissioner, for example, but it may affect your operational capability. So how do you start sharing that information when we're going through? And we have to make it really simple. When you look at the number of companies in Canada, I can't give you the exact number, but if you said 98% of all companies in Canada are small, a lot of them don't have the ability to actually do some of that reporting. So what's the kind of mechanisms and things that we can put in place to make it easier for small and medium-sized companies to participate in this collaboration, in this sharing, and I say sharing of knowledge about what's going to happen, not just telling me after the fact that something occurred, because quite often, as I say, I want to prevent the attacks from occurring. I don't want to have companies having to put a report in to the privacy commissioner that they've been attacked, or another regulatory body. Let's be proactive about this.
Okay, Christian, we're down to our last few minutes here, and I guess I do want to follow up on this private sector angle here. Obviously, companies have put a lot of their operations online because it has been a more efficient way to do business. I'm wondering, given how that also increases their vulnerability to these kinds of attacks, whether you believe more of their business ought to be taken offline so that they are not so vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
I think it's a matter of rethinking this particular environment, so that we need to learn to live in compromised environments. We need to understand that our networks are likely permanently compromised. And so how do we protect the elements of the network and of the data that are absolutely critical against those that are not? And so those are conversations about, for instance, how do we make both our networks and our data, as well as Canadian society, more resilient? How do we build more and better redundancy into our networks? And in particular, how do we create some standards to which everybody has to live up? Now, we see this in the private sector. Stephanie mentioned cyber insurance. That's a really interesting development because it's a market-based solution, and the insurance company will require certain standards of you in order to insure you, and then will assess their premium based on the risk environment that you've created within the company. But I think we also need, and we see this coming out of the UK, perhaps a cyber certification regime, perhaps voluntary for the private sector, where companies large and small can sign on to a certain level of certification that provides some sort of assurance, both in terms of the industrial control systems, but also in terms of their interactions with clients, in terms of the behavioral side, that this company meets a particular standard. Because companies, look, security is fundamentally a cost in terms of the bottom line. And so the incentive is, what are you going to spend? If you're Colonial Pipeline, yes, it's a major news story, but it's not like you can send your oil through another pipeline. This is sort of your only option. Whereas if you're a bank and you end up getting compromised, chances are that's an existential risk to your business model, the reputational risk associated. So you can't afford that type of risk, and so you're going to be much more aggressive in terms of how you invest in your infrastructure. And so I think we need to find a way to raise all the boats in port. And so how do we bring in the tide to make that happen?
Stephanie, let me give you the last minute on this. The case of Colonial was a big case, got a lot of attention. They took a big hit. For Canada, is it not a question of if that will happen to us, but when?
Yes, I think if there's a good bad news story in there, it's that it's not just Canada; it's pretty much anyone. This story really does show that anyone, anywhere can be hit in this way, and as Christian just pointed out, like where there's not these kinds of redundancies, these industries, these critical infrastructure sectors will suffer. So it is super important for these people in industries and critical infrastructure to learn about this case, to understand the lessons of it. And again, I mean, if there is a very thin silver lining here, it's that when these incidents happen, we do see a spike in interest in cybersecurity issues and people trying to see if they can do better and how they can improve their own cybersecurity. But we have to make sure that interest is sustained, that when we have these incidents, it isn't just a flash in a pan, but that we can generate a true cybersecurity culture, and that Christian just spoke about, so we can do our best to deter by denial.
Well, we hope we've made a modest contribution to that greater understanding here tonight on TVO. And I want to thank Stephanie Carvin and Christian Leuprecht and Robert Gordon for joining us to that end. Be safe out there, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.